Hello and welcome to Antinatalism this week. One breaking news update before we start. David Benatar's interview with Lawrence and Anton will be released in a few hours from now. By the time you watch this video, it may already be available. The interview focuses on Benatar's new book, Very Practical Ethics. This is at least the second interview Benatar has given on this topic, the first being on the channel The Dissenter. Additionally, there is a second video in which Lawrence asks a few extra questions. This will be linked to the main interview and I will leave the link to that in the description. And now on to our regular news. A new article, Do Prospective Parents Have a Duty to Adopt Rather Than Procreate by Eric Magnuson, will be part of the upcoming issue of Public Affairs Quarterly Journal. Many times we hear something like, why bring a new child into the world when there are so many orphans already? Signs talking about adoption are seen even in antinatalist outreaches. Eric criticizes this claim that it is wrong to bring new children into existence when there are so many existing children in need of parental care. Eric asks if prospective parents really have a moral duty to adopt. If they have such a duty, on what basis do they have it? One such place to look at is the rescue-based argument. If you can prevent serious harm to someone at a lesser cost to yourself, then you must do it. It is your duty to prevent such harm. A classic example is the shallow pond thought experiment by Peter Singer. If you are on your way to work and you see a small child drowning in a shallow pond, stepping in to save the child will ruin your workflows and make you late. However, the cost is trivial compared to the harm that you're preventing, which is that the child's death by drowning. And thus it is your duty to rescue that child. Two main premises of this argument are: one, you have the capacity to prevent harm, and two, the cost to you is relatively low. Similarly, if you are a prospective parent, do you have a duty to adopt an existing orphan instead of procreating a new child? Eric says no. That's because there are two main problems with this claim. First, just because you have the capacity to prevent harm does not mean that you must do it. In the shallow pond scenario, the child is drowning, but there may be others around that pond who could save the child at much lower cost than you. For instance, a professional lifeguard or a casual swimmer nearby could intervene more easily. In such a case, it is hard to argue that only you have a duty to save that child. Maybe you have a duty if the lifeguard neglects their work, but otherwise the lifeguard has a stronger duty than you. Similarly, with adoption, the orphan crisis is a collective duty of society as a whole. You can contribute to solving this crisis in various ways, but that does not necessarily mean you must adopt. If adoption were a moral obligation, then those who want to remain child-free would also have a duty to adopt, which would mean they could no longer remain child-free. Secondly, the cost of adoption is not small. Foregoing the pleasures of biological procreation is one such cost for those who wish to experience it. Financial costs are another factor, along with emotional toll of navigating adoption agencies and bureaucratic waiting periods. Of course, there are also costs associated with having biological children, but this does not make adoption any less costly to the extent that it becomes a moral duty. I agree with much of what Eric says, but here's what I think. Whether to adopt or not should be an independent question from whether to reproduce. As an antinatalist, the answer to reproduction is a clear no. I'm not considering the phased out extinction scenarios here, but as far as reproduction is concerned, the answer is clearly no. But adoption is something one does beyond their moral duties as an individual while also satisfying their parenting desires. On a collective level, however, society has a moral duty to minimize the number of orphans or even abolish orphanhood altogether. And of course, one way to prevent the production of orphans is antinatalism. To retrofit this view into the shallow pond analogy, saving the child could be seen as either a relative duty or a charitable action, depending on how the thought experiment is framed. However, regardless of how you interpret it, you have a moral obligation not to bring another new child into that pond. Speaking of Eric Magnuson, he has also written a new book, Procreative Justice, Balancing the Interests of Parents, Children and Society, which will be released in July this year. Looking at the title and abstract, it is not an antinatalist book in the sense that Eric is not against all procreation. However, he highlights the conflicts between what parents and society want and the harms caused to children by bringing them into existence. He proposes a narrower view of the conditions under which it is morally permissible to procreate and much more demanding conception of our procreative responsibilities. A third episode in the series about marzipan, the guinea pig, was released on the Exploring Antinatalism podcast. The original thought experiment was that I have a pet guinea pig, marzipan, who is currently living a happy and healthy life. However, I'm going to die early due to some reason, and there will be no one to care for marzipan. As a result, she will suffer. So, should I euthanize her before my death to prevent the suffering she would otherwise have to endure after I, her caretaker, am gone? Mati Hairi wants to determine whether euthanizing marzipan would align with the ideas presented in Better Never to Have Been, a book by David Benatar published back in 2006. Mati points out that Benatar acknowledges that death can, in some cases, be less bad than the continuation of life. However, Benatar's focus was primarily on humans. He placed the decision to end one's life on the individual whose life it is. But in Mati's marzipan experiment, the subject is a non-human animal, which lacks two key things. One, moral agency to rationally decide whether to end her life or continue it. And two, a sense of valuable future, meaning she cannot be deprived of future goals if she does not have any future goals. While marzipan does not have moral agency, she does have conscious interests. This brings up the issue of consent. Even though she cannot communicate her consent in a language that I can understand, killing her without her consent might still be morally wrong. However, from another perspective, if preventing suffering is the overriding factor, can we still justify euthanizing her? Mati highlights two principles that would need to be met to justify this decision. One, I should be responsible for her suffering in some way. If I die without euthanizing her, my decision not to kill her contributes to her future suffering, meaning I could be held responsible for it. Two, the distinction between actively causing harm and passively allowing suffering to occur must be made irrelevant. In marzipan's case, my inaction of not euthanizing her would result in her suffering later on. The central question then is what Better Never to Have Been tells us about such cases. Benatar has argued that abortion should be performed before the fetus achieves conscious interests. However, he has not recommended killing of a fetus that has already acquired some form of conscious interests, even if that fetus will go on to suffer in life. That fetus or even a newborn baby can be replaced in the thought experiment. We have to be careful about the guardrails of the thought experiment, however. Generally, if the primary caretaker of a human baby dies, there are at least some mechanisms to replace them. But in absence of any caretaker, we can ask the question of whether euthanizing such a baby is justified before her caretaker succumbs to death. This is a complex issue, so thanks to Mati for exploring it. By now, you might be wondering, what does David Benatar himself have to say about all of this? If you would like David Benatar to respond to Mati's arguments, please give a thumbs up to the pinned comment below this video. The Dissenter featured an interview with Todd May, the author of the newly published book Should We Go Extinct? A Philosophical Dilemma for Our Unbearable Times. No prizes for guessing, this was more about extinction than antinatalism, with a primary focus on human extinction. In the interview, Todd analyzed both perspectives, exploring how human extinction could be seen as both good and bad. However, his arguments for why human extinction could be considered bad were not very convincing.
Good. On both sides, Ricardo?
Yes.
Okay. So on the side for continuing, there are things that we bring to the planet that other species, other animals cannot bring, or at least they can't bring it to the same extent. Right? And I talk about several things. Right? One is the levels of happiness that humans can generate, right? And a happier planet is better than a less happy planet. So there are dimensions of happiness that we have. We have projects that we can extend into the future, recognizing certain relationships that will extend into the future. All of these can bring us kinds of happiness, dimensions of happiness that non-human animals aren't capable of nearly to the extent that we are. That's one thing.
I'm not sure what he means by planet here. Does he just mean, in literal terms, the large spherical rock that orbits the sun for no apparent reason? If so, why would that matter? The planet itself is not sentient. So, why would bringing happiness on this planet be a reason for our species to continue?
Right. Another thing is that we bring to the planet the creation of art, right, and science, and not only the creation of art and science, but the appreciation of art and science and other things like sports. And I think most of us think that if these things, art, science, sports, and whatnot, were to disappear from the planet, that would be a loss for the planet. That the planet would, in some ways, be impoverished if if the planet would be impoverished if that were no longer aspects of the planet.
How can an insentient rock be impoverished by something? How can it be deprived of anything? Do we think that Mars is an impoverished planet? What about space? Is it impoverished simply because it has nothing, whereas there could have been something? Or maybe by planet he means it figuratively, that life on this planet would be impoverished. But if humans go extinct, do other animals really care about art or music? There are sporadic cases of animals enjoying human generated musical sounds, but that's far from suggesting that animals as a whole would be deprived of those things.
Right. So there are those two things. Right. A third element is one that's brought up by Samuel Scheffler, right, in his book Death and Its Afterlives. He says, look, one of the things that give humans meaningfulness in their lives is the sense that whatever they're doing, there will be other human beings that will continue it, or that will appreciate it, or that will be able somehow to take it up. Right? And if we were to go extinct, that wouldn't be there. So for Scheffler, a lot of what makes our lives meaningful is the thought that not just our kids will continue, but that there will be others that will continue to take up everything from our research to the guy who owns a grocery store down the block, and other people will continue to shop there.
Okay, this is true to a certain extent. I mean, it's true that other people provide us with a sense of purpose for what we do. Part of the reason I'm making this video, aside from the fact that I enjoy certain aspects of doing it, is the hope that someone will watch it. Even as an antinatalist, it gives purpose to my actions knowing that there are other people consuming what I produce. But that's exactly what David Benatar calls terrestrial meaning. This kind of meaning is relevant when discussing individuals. But when we talk about species and extinction, we need a meaning that extends beyond just our own species, something like cosmic meaning. Otherwise, it just becomes a circular argument. And such cosmic meaning does not exist. The universe is indifferent to whether we continue as a species or go extinct.
I mean, when it comes to the values that humanity brings into the world, there is one particular kind of argument here that perhaps for me it's a little bit harder to understand. That is when people argue that the universe itself would lose value if humanity went extinct. I mean, could you explain what that means exactly? And do you agree with that kind of argument?
Yeah, I talk about this somewhat in the book. If you said the universe would lose value, it makes it sound as though it's going to be some loss that the universe is going to regret. Right? But the universe doesn't regret that, because that's not the kinds of things universes do. Right? So the question then becomes pressing in the way that you've asked it. And the way I put it is this: if we were no longer here, that wouldn't be a loss for any of the other animals that are here, right? Nobody would experience that loss. So the question is, in what sense is it a loss? And the only place from where it can be a loss is from our perspective, from our view of what creates richness, on the planet, right, in the world. So for us to look and say a planet without science and art and sports, etc., is impoverished, is to take a human perspective and say, from the perspective that we occupy, that seems an impoverishment. Now, If we weren't here, there would be nobody to feel the impoverishment. But we are here.
Okay, so the loss is not to the planet or to the universe, it is to us. But I'm not sure how it is a loss to us if we are not there to experience it. Anyway, they further discuss other topics including antinatalism, long termism, and Todd's own opinions on these subjects. But Todd actually misses a major reason why we should continue to exist. I remember Amanda bringing this up in Todd's Exploring Antinatalism podcast at the time. Humans are the only species with both moral agency and the technological capability to do something about the suffering of other animals and humans. Unfortunately, this aspect was not considered in the discussion. Instead, aesthetic concerns were given undue importance. Now, I may disagree with a lot of what Todd has said, but I appreciate that we are having these discussions. You can also visit his website, toddmayphilosopher.com, and thanks to Ricardo, the Dissenter channel's host, for this interview. Antinatalism Japan has a new Discord server where you can ask questions or discuss antinatalism and related topics. It is in Japanese, but Google Translate works well enough for communication. So if you are interested, feel free to join the server. Ethan Mehta, who has a YouTube channel called Mehta Ethics, has released a new music video on another channel. It's a full-on antinatalist song titled I Wish I Stayed in the Ballsack. Now, I must warn you that it's not for the light-hearted, but if you are an antinatalist, it's worth a giggle anyway. Now on to some pronatalism this week news. The Guardian has an article titled The Rise of Pronatalism, Why Musk, Vance, and the Right Want Women to Have More Babies. The article focuses on what's happening in the US, specifically in the US politics regarding birth rates and the issue of having children. There seems to be an incoherent coalition of different groups promoting higher birth rates. On one side, you have traditional conservatives who uphold family values, with having children being a fundamental part of that framework. On the other side are Silicon Valley tech bros who are narrowly focused on declining birth rates and fears of population collapse. Elon Musk now has 14 children with multiple women. So, yes, he is increasing the birth rate, but he can hardly be said to be upholding traditional family values. Then there are politicians like J.D. Vance, Donald Trump, Speaker Mike Johnson, among others. What binds these diverse groups together is pronatalism, which the article states has become a key ideological plank in the bridge between tech bro right-wingers like Musk and more traditional religious conservatives. But there are cracks in that bridge. For example, Donald Trump recently signed a pro-IVF executive order. Elon Musk is a big consumer of IVF. However, IVF involves discarding embryos that are not viable for gestation, which does not sit well with the anti-abortion lobby within the Republican Party. Another example is the child tax credit. Vice President J.D. Vance has teased this idea on multiple occasions. If implemented, it would cost trillions of dollars. This is essentially a welfare scheme which leans more on the left ideologically and contrasts sharply with the Doge initiative to cut government spending. All in all, an interesting article, but I like the title photo of this article. It's like all these naked political toddlers dancing and causing chaos on American flag, which is symbolically fitting for what's happening in reality. Business Standard published an article titled Having Children May Keep Your Brain Younger and Fitter, says new study. The article cites a study in Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences titled Protective Role of Parenthood on Age-Related Brain Function in Mid to Late Life. It explains how having more children may actually benefit brain health for both men and women. Of course, this does not provide sufficient moral justification for having children, but I would not be surprised if pronatalists start using this as an excuse once they find out about this. There were two articles cautioning against the failures of pronatalist policies that governments and figures like Donald Trump, Viktor Orban, Putin, and Xi are eager to implement. One was in The Conversation titled Why We Should Not Let Lower Fertility Rates Fuel Pronatalist Policies by Celine Delacroix, and the other was from American Enterprise Institute titled Pronatalism Fails versus Demographic Adaptations by James Petokokis. The theme was similar. Pronatalist policies such as tax credits for having more children or other incentives don't really work. Instead of trying to reverse declining fertility rates, we should adapt to the changing demographics. The Conversation article concludes concludes, the idea that we must endlessly expand is a modern fiction, not a historical norm. We are now entering the age of depopulation, a period characterized by lower fertility levels and in time population decline. We must prepare and embrace this shift instead of trying to reverse it. Meanwhile, the American Enterprise Institute article states rather than spending more on failed fertility incentives, policymakers might better focus on technological adaptations along with increased immigration to demographic inevitability. The future belongs not to those who fight population decline most vigorously, but to those who adapt to it most intelligently. James provides an interesting example from Japan. Japanese businesses increasingly deploy service robots that work alongside humans rather than replace them. At Tokyo restaurants, reports the Financial Times, cat-themed robots deliver desserts with cheerful meows, exemplifying a pragmatic workaround to demographic challenges. This is interesting because we have historical precedent for such shifts. Horse-drawn carts were replaced by automobile because they were more efficient, leading to a dramatic decline in the horse population. From an antinatalist perspective, this was a good thing. A similar transformation is happening in the meat and dairy industry today, with lab-grown alternatives being developed. If these alternatives succeed, they could spare billions of animals from coming into existence. And now we have robots capable of replacing human workers. As long as these robots are not sentient, we should celebrate this development. And those were the stories I noticed this week. Thanks for watching and see you next time.